Hello! It's Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with another Alberta Leadership Race update. I will, straight off the bat, have two things to say. So first, kind of take the map with a bit of salt. Long story short, as with a lot of leadership races and how the maps work, I'm not super excited about how the map is forecasting because I just don't have enough data. Like, I'm looking at ways to try to squeeze another one or two updates in this and try to figure out how to project this without the data I want. Because what I've done previously is I've used data based on like what the different parties have liked. For example, which candidate is preferred by the NDP, which by the Conservative Party, etc. Unfortunately, there's only been a single poll with that data. So, not super great. Now you could say, well, why should you need that? Well, it does really help you characterize different areas, because otherwise you get, the way my model works, we don't have previous raw riding data to feed into it. It projects very smooth riding results. This normally is not a problem in most elections I do. Like, if I do a Canadian national election, that's not a problem because I know what the results in 2019 were. And typically, in a big election like Quebec, even where we have new parties coming in who don't have any meaningful historical records, we get enough vote change information, i.e. how people voted in the last election and how they want to vote now, to compensate for that. In this case, we have very little of either of those data. We have no historical or last election data, and we have very little vote change data. So that makes it very difficult. We also don't have really any data to go with based on like the area type of the riding. Like, more or less what I'm working with at this point, data, like demographic data wise for this, is age, sex, a little bit education, and a little bit income. And education level and income is pretty marginal too. Those are old polls and only 2 polls, so not ideal. So I guess all this to say, take the map with a grain of salt. The data I need to actually project proper map things currently doesn't exist. And before you say, well, you have these demographic data, can't you do that? Well, sort of. Like, I can tell you as a whole what the men in Alberta want for the UCP, or the men in Alberta want for the UCP leader. I can tell you that. But that doesn't help me project different ridings, because the men in Calgary and Fort McMurray versus Edmonton versus Red Deer, they're not the same. Unsurprisingly, people aren't the same everywhere, and different voting trends do different things. And a lot of the things that I would do for Canada or Quebec or Ontario or the US, I can't do here because the data is so bad. And this is why I don't often do races like this, because the data is terrible. It's really bad. One of the only reasons I'm doing this race is because, and I realized, apologies here, I spelled Daniela's name wrong, but I'm not going to restart this video. And I'm not going to edit it. Screw editing. So, I guess all of this to say, the main reason I'm doing this is I think this is actually a very important election in the term for Canada. In the trend, in the track record of Canada, like where Canada's going. Because even though Taze is still technically second place, or third place, this election really is between Smith and Taze. Like, Gene actually has some wild polling. Ledger has him leading right now, and Main Street has him wildly behind, so I have no idea what's going on there. But I'm more inclined to believe Main Street on this one. Ledger doesn't have a super good track record in Alberta specifically. But generally speaking, I'm considering this race kind of a difference between contest between Smith and Taze, and it's kind of the more populist, potentially more national conservatism inclined candidate versus the more moderate, more traditional conservative, I guess is the way to say it. And I will really strongly note here that when we're talking about Alberta, moderate conservative is not what the same thing you would consider a moderate national conservative. Whereas you might consider nationally a moderate conservative maybe a red Tory, in Alberta that's not at all. Taze is definitely closer to Poilievre than he is to Charest on policy. The big difference between Taze and Smith isn't really on economics. It's on social issues. And very much populism versus not populism. And that's what makes this an interesting race, worth forecasting, even though the data is really bad. So, what you should read from this map isn't that Smith is going to sweep all of rural Alberta. You should read from this map that Smith is ahead in rural Alberta, and she's ahead in Calgary, and Jean is presently ahead in Edmonton. The other thing I want to say here, right at the top of the video, well, we're not really at the top anymore, is I am prototyping a different way of coloring districts. Let me know in the comments what you think of this. Instead of going by the win percentage of the candidate, I'm going by the margin of victory. So basically, Calgary here, Smith is leading by 10 points in Calgary, so it's in this dark purple color here. Edmonton's easy to see. Most of Edmonton, Jean is leading by less than 1, so he's in this very light green. And some it's slightly more than 1, and he's in this darker green. Let me know if you like that better than what I have done previously. I'm experimenting with this, and depending on how people like, I might do this going forward. I might not. We'll see. The main reason I do this is otherwise my typical color scheme, I was using everything would be the same color pretty much. So this was slightly more colorful. So just on a model end on my end, not super confident in this projection. I really want more data here. I don't think I'm going to get more data. So we're gonna go with it. Take this with a huge cup of salt. The ridings. The popular vote, I'm relatively confident in. It's just the way my model works, and I cannot stress this enough, the way this model works is absent sufficient riding data. This will create a very, very smooth result by area or by region. And in Alberta, I have 3 regions. We have Edmonton, we have Calgary, and we have the rest of Alberta. And that's from polling. And, well, this creates a very smooth result in every single region. Calgary by plus 10, the rest of Alberta by actually plus 8, and Edmonton is around 1 to 2 plus for Jean, but Smith is narrowly ahead in a couple ridings. So, for some reason, I've classified these as Alberta, or they're clearly Alberta. Sorry, Edmonton. I might redefine that. For some reason, I put them there. I have no good reason for that, but so that's kind of where the model is. We'll see. And again, I'm going to experiment on something different, but now, how does this race going to go, though? So I have thought about doing some experimentation on who will actually win, per se, because unlike the Conservative leadership race, this one we don't have. What's the word for it? We don't seem to be looking at someone who's going to run away on first ballot. And unfortunately, because of a hurricane, I did not have power this weekend. So I didn't have any time until today, which is Monday, as a recording, to do that. So we don't have that. But I don't really have time to postpone this video because I also have to do stuff for Canada and some other races. So we don't have time to postpone it, so we're just going it here. I will say I do plan on doing an update sometime later before the race ends. I can't promise when, and it really depends on scheduling, but I do want to do an update before the race ends where I do forecast second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh round results. Just so we can clearly see who's going to win. But without that, I can say in this particular distribution of party or of the top three, I think it's kind of a toss-up between Jean and Smith. I'm going to say Smith would narrowly beat Jean, but not very clear if he would actually win or lose. Jean, that is. They're similar candidates. They're a bit different, but they're pretty similar. I would say Smith seems like her campaign and her pitch, she's leaning into it harder, whereas Jean is kind of nervous about going into it, where Smith is really leaning into the populist national conservatism, whereas Jean is like kind of tiptoeing, like sticking his foot into it, but isn't really confident. So, well, between the two of them, I think it would be pretty hard to say who's going to win. I think realistically, though, I suspect the ledger polls are not correct, and I don't think Jean is leading the pact, which is pulling up my average and putting him above Taze. I don't think that's true at all. I think the Main Street is much more accurate in this regard, and I might do some weighting there. But at the moment, again, I really only had 4 or 5 hours to 4 or 5, not even really. I only had a couple hours to look into this. I had some other things I had to fix too about this, and they weren't always productive. So I think realistically the race is coming down between Smith and Taze. Right. And between the two of them, I think we'll still see Smith win. Because at the end of the day, you look at the Main Street polls, which are great for headline numbers, but they don't give us any of the demographic data. But in this regard, the demographic data Main Street normally publishes wouldn't actually fix the main problems I'm having with my model right now. So I guess mixed curse, mixed blessing. I don't know. The bigger one though is what's the word for this? So Main Street has Smith winning in I think round 5 or whatever when it becomes Smith versus Taze. And Ledger has Jean beating Taze in also round 5, with in either case Smith and or Jean being the last person to drop out, making this clearly a 3-person race. And I am technically forecasting the other candidates, but I honestly with the number of polls we're seeing, I probably am just going to ignore them. I might not even throw actual number percentages on them because, frankly, the amount of polls, very narrow. The quality of poll, very questionable. And I don't expect the model to predict it accurately. I am predicting them. So, if it turns out that I am correct, I'm going to brag about that. But if they're not correct, I'm not even going to consider that a miss because I think it's just noise. But the problem with this video here, and I'm having a bit struggling on words here, is it's very hard to really explain what I'm thinking here. Like, that's not a very satisfying response, I know, but a lot of this is on gut, and I don't really like to just invoke my gut when I'm explaining things, but in this case, I will just invoke the gut. My gut tells me in the current environment, Smith is going to win. Right? You can look at candidates, and you can look at things, and you can look at how the math will break, but and yeah, I think you can make an argument that she's going to win based on that, but this is more of a visceral thing. I spent a couple of years now heavily invested in not just Canada, not just the US, but pretty much all the Western countries in the world, looking at their polls, looking at the elections. I've not made videos on every single one of them. I'm regretful to have missed the Italian one, but I did not have time on my schedule to actually do anything for that. I really wanted to, but they had to call their election a year early. Damn it. But I've done a lot of research and a lot of looking at all this. And around the West, in almost every single case, the trend is the right wing is going more populist and more national conservatism. I would not say Smith, historically, has been the most arch right-winger. I'm not going to say she wasn't right-wing, but I would not call her time leading the Wild Rose Party as the staunchest, most hardcore right-wing candidate ever. Someone like your average Republican would probably make Smith look very moderate. Someone like Giorgia Meloni would probably make her look almost like a liberal. But compared to Taze, she is leaning more into that energy right now. Does that mean she's actually believes that? I'm not really sure. Her track record in the Wild Rose Party does put some questions on how much she actually believes what she's currently saying. Because she has made comments before about not liking and wanting to distance away from social conservative positions while she was the leader of the Wild Rose Party. And that does bring into question how genuine she is in the position and the people she's pitching towards. However, Taze isn't aiming for that group. Again, he is going for the more mainstream, moderate conservative. The conservative that has done well historically in Canada. Done well electorally, I should say. It's debatable as a conservative if mainstream conservatism in Canada is actually effective. We could discuss that in a different video if you want to. Let me know below. But it remains to be seen in my mind, again, how effective mainstream conservatism in Canada actually is. But ignoring that question for the moment, he's aiming more towards that. And Brian Jean seems to be trying to straddle both lines and try to have his cake and eat it too. And in all of my experience in forecasting elections, either publicly or just privately myself, I can't possibly see that working. If Brian Jean wins this leadership race, that will fly in the face of all of the wisdom I've gathered while doing this. Like, this is more based on my gut experience and trends I've observed on a broad level than particular things about this particular race. But there's really not much to say about this particular race in and of itself. The candidates have been pretty stagnant. There's not really much interesting controversy. There's some stuff about Smith's what even it? I can't even think of the name of her act. The Nullification Act. I can't even think of what she's calling it. But anyways, the bill she's proposing to cancel federal laws that she doesn't like or hurt Alberta. Now, there's more nuance to that than I'm giving her, but the gist of it is the Alberta Independence Act? This is bugging me now. What is this called? Bear with me. Sovereignty Act. The Alberta Sovereignty Act. There's some stuff around that, and the Lieutenant Governor saying they're going to veto it and blah, blah, blah. I don't care. Like, it is some controversy, but maybe it's more controversial going on in Alberta, but out east over here, it hasn't really made much headline news. So, and the overall campaign videos seem pretty stagnant, and the campaign stuff I've seen from the candidates seem pretty stagnant. So, the race doesn't really look dynamic from out east. Again, if you're from Alberta and you're watching this, by all means comment below if you think I'm completely off base there. But from my perspective out east, when I have power, it doesn't look like the actual candidates are doing much. Like, it seems very stagnant. And the polling so far kind of suggests that. There's not really any movement at all in the polls. So, there's not much to say by itself, more in the general scheme of trends in the West, right? And again, that's where this is interesting. So I think it is very, very possible, not almost certain, that's too strong, very likely that Smith does win this. And it's possible, if she plays her cards right and does a good campaign, she could even theoretically win a first ballot win if she campaigns closer to Poilievre and people believe her. And I will note too, even on that, I would not even really call Poilievre that strong of the national conservatism type that is reigning supreme in most countries at this point. He's staunch conservative. He's a populist. Though, kind of a populist light, frankly. But he doesn't have, at least publicly, the full-on support of social conservative issues that national conservatism typically entails. In that regard, possibly national conservatism might not be popular at all in Canada, which would make us a bit of an anomaly. At least on the electoral level, on the ideological level, and the level of commentators and political theorists and thought leaders, if you want to use that term, I would say national conservatism is actually the main, the growing ideology. So the question really comes down to in this race. And I think this is what decides the race. Smith is campaigning in the right lane with the right ideas to win. All historical trends, all present data says she should win. The main question is, what stage? Is it a first ballot win? Is it a fifth ballot win? Is it a decisive win? Is it a narrow win? The only thing that could mess this up for Smith is if she pivots at all, or if people perceive her as an opportunist and not sincerely believing this. Maybe she could use white lies and opportunism to get in power and might even win an election, because this is Alberta we're talking about. It'd be very difficult for a united Conservative Party, regardless of the ideology leading it, to lose. It's not impossible, but it's not very likely. However, if the party membership, the grassroots, perceives her as just an opportunist who doesn't believe what she says, she will be thrown out faster than you can believe it. Potentially, if Smith doesn't follow through on what she's actually campaigning as right now, if she tries to pivot at all from her campaign, I think we will see her possibly be the shortest-lived premier in Canadian history, because the Alberta elections in, what is this, May? I think it's in May. I will amend that. The shortest-lived premier who didn't lose an election immediately. Because I'm sure there's been some that are like poor Kim Campbell, who were given power like 3 months before an election and immediately lose. But she might be the shortest-lived premier who actually wins an election if she pivots or doesn't follow through on what she's saying right now. It is very possible in that timeline that Alberta starts going into the phase the UK Tories are doing, where they keep having leadership races to find new leaders, and every single leadership race, the winning candidate is trying to sell national conservatism to get elected, and then they get elected, and then they immediately turn it around, ignore it. It might be national conservatism light, it might be full-throated national conservatism, depending on the candidate. But they all lean into that. They all put their hands in that well. And then you have Boris Johnson betray it. Liz Truss, we'll see. I don't think she's going to follow through on it. It's possible we might see that in Alberta, because again, Smith is saying the right things, and she's walking the right walk right now to win. And that's why she's leading in the polls. But there is doubt, based on her track record, based on her past, that she might be doing this opportunistically and not because she actually intends to do it. And that's really the big risk for Smith. Now, I watch a lot of elections. I look at a lot of polls. Literally every single day. Dozens of countries. I don't have any advice for someone like Smith on how to actually sell to people that you're not an opportunist, that you're genuine, especially in the age of the internet. Once you have that label, once you have that track record, it's hard to come back from that. Is that affecting Smith right now? I don't strictly think so, though it might be if you believe the ledger polls. If the ledger polls are correct, maybe it is, because she's actually losing ground quite significantly in ledger polls. She's relatively flat to the Main Street polls. So, if people are perceiving her as possibly opportunistic, well, maybe she doesn't have a chance. And I think there is a lot of people who do perceive her as this. Are they genuine? Do they matter that they... Are these a relevant faction of people? I don't know. And this is kind of the story of this race. For the United Conservative Party, the race is kind of irrelevant, because I'm pretty sure any of these candidates will beat the NDP. And it's not even anything to do with Notley herself or the Alberta NDP. It has nothing to do with them. Frankly, I think Notley might possibly be one of the better the top 3 NDP politicians in the country for what I perceive as political competence. And when I say political competence here, I do not necessarily mean I agree with what they're saying. I might not even agree at all. But they seem to know who to campaign to and how to campaign. She seems to be one of the best in the NDP at that. In other words, she seems like a very competent NDP politician at being a politician. But the environment in Alberta is just so hostile to literally any party that's left of center. But the NDP in particular, because the federal NDP really just wanted to kind of destroy Alberta. Like, the core industries that actually make Alberta prosperous, the oil and gas industry, are like target number 1 for the Liberals and the NDP. So it's very hard to see them ever really succeeding against a united Conservative Party. Because remember, 2015, when the NDP won in Alberta, that was because the Wild Rose and the United Conservatives had split the vote. But collectively, they had about 55%. So when they combined again to form the UCP, they won immediately, and by almost the exact 55% that they lost by, or they had combined last time. So I think any of these leaders will actually just win the next election. Kenny himself only became a liability to the party because everyone perceived him as not everyone, a large faction of the party perceived him as flip-floppy and weak regarding the COVID things, the COVID policies. I'm not sure what percentage of the Alberta Conservatives actually were offended by this, but what we can say with a clear certainty is it was enough. I'm not likely going to update an Alberta election model anytime soon because there hasn't been any relevant poll since the last time I did it. I think there was one ledger poll and it didn't really change any results. So you can still refer to that video. But my take on the last, let's say, 18 months of polling in Alberta before Kenny was being replaced and the UCP started doing better again, isn't strictly that the NDP was doing better. I think there was almost zero voters who are going from UCP to NDP. Probably some, but I bet if you polled it, it's likely 4 to 5%, which is what you would expect normally. You generally expect about 5% of voters in a party in Canada to change their vote intention. 5 to 10%, I should say, typically change their vote intention. We have very sticky parties in Canada. Some places like Italy have not sticky parties at all. But in Canada, our parties are very sticky. What I suspect was in reality a very large proportion of 2019 Alberta UCP voters might have been voting Wild Rose, but I'm not sure Wild Rose Independence Party. I'm not sure how, though that I'm skeptical on. I think a lot were just not going to vote. I think there is a very large body of people in the West right now who don't understand voter turnout. They see the voter turnout almost continuously fall, with rare exceptions, but as a general trend seems to fall. Year after year, election after election. And some have said, it's the voting system's discouraging voters. The politicians aren't really activating the people. They're not promising things to young people, so the young people aren't voting, etc., etc. No. The voting system one is pretty bunk. You can look at Italy, Sweden, Canada, US. All of them have slightly different voting systems. And yes, the US one is slightly different than Canada's. They're both first past the post, but slightly different flavors. Again, UK. Again, France. Almost every country you can find, every voting system you can name where it's not legally required to vote, voter turnout turns down. The only reason it went up in 2020 is because the US radically expanded mail-in voting, which made it trivial to vote, which is a whole different topic, but in general, stupid. The reason for this, and the reason why I suspect the polls were showing this in Alberta, the only reason the polls were showing the NDP leading in Alberta, outside of just polling error, was the UCP voter base just didn't want to vote. If, as a voter, you think every party is the same, or they're all going to do the same thing, then my choice doesn't matter, why do you vote? That's what was happening with Kenney in charge. Kenney had adopted many of the policies that the NDP advocated for during the pandemic response. You may or may not disagree with what he actually did, but it angered the right wing of his party. Some might have went to vote Wild Rose Independence. I don't actually think that was very many. Again, the polls aren't that detailed on it, but I don't think it was a meaningful percentage. At least any more than you would normally expect abandoning a party. I think a lot of it was they just didn't want to vote. And that's the big danger, really, with this leadership race for the UCP. And that was the big danger in the Conservative leadership race federally. You need to pick a leader that has the nerve to be different than the opposition. In that regard, I suspect if Smith sticks to her guns, she will win easily against the NDP. In fact, she might even win a larger victory than Kenney. Now, this is very far a prognostication, and I don't really like making projections that far in the future. But based on all the trends I've ever seen, that seems the most likely to me. Jean and Taze? Hard to say. I suspect Taze would probably win. Jean likely to, but the problem you start getting in with someone like Jean is, from what I've seen in his campaign, I don't know if Jean really knows what he wants to be. And voters know that. Voters understand when a leader doesn't really know what they are. Taze and Smith have that in spades. The only question with Taze is, will he be exciting enough? Because say what you will about someone like Smith and radical ideas like the Alberta Sovereignty Act, but people, especially voters, generic voters, like people who have take charge, bold ideas. In general terms, the average person, especially when you're talking about something as obscure and unclear what the actual effects would be, like the Alberta Sovereignty Act, doesn't actually really understand what's going on. And it's not because these people are incapable of understanding. They just don't spend the time learning about it. And again, this is where I love any comments, because anecdotal information, really good to understanding things. Anecdotes are not data, but anecdotes inform data. But in my experience talking to people, left-wingers, right-wingers, squishy centrists, people who don't really have any coherent worldview, they like bold ideas. That's why, if you are a left-wing or you are a right-winger, you will probably experience this, where you will see a policy idea that the other party's doing, and you'll be like, why does anyone want that? That sounds like a terrible idea. I'm sure every single person watching this video has experienced that. I've experienced that. Why would anyone want that policy? It seems so clear that that is dumb. The thing is, though, if you sit down for one and think of these policies, I won't name any because, I'm typically right-wing. So I will only name left-wing policies. But that doesn't mean this doesn't happen to you left-wingers, if I have any of you watching. Comment below if you are actually watching. I try not to be overtly biased enough in how I'm analyzing things, but I typically do. I am right-wing, so there's that. But you will have seen one of these issues, and you don't understand, like you're confused by it. It doesn't make sense. But almost all of these issues are big, bold ideas. The Alberta Sovereignty Act is one of these. Someone who might understand how government works, who might have a really high-level understanding of what this would actually mean, might think this is a terrible idea. Or you might think it's a good idea. I'm going to say, big, bold idea. Similarly, this is, I think, relatively speaking, not left or right, In Quebec, you have Bill 21. Was it Bill 21? The religious symbols ban. That's a big, bold idea. You might disagree with it. You might hate it. You might think it's unconstitutional. You might think it's discriminatory. But the thing is, to the Francophone voter who's very concerned about the erasure of their culture and their heritage and their language, who really doesn't like overt religious symbolism, this is a big, bold idea that might do something about that. And that's one of the things in politics that I think a lot of people, even those who should know better, political pundits, campaign managers, politicians, don't understand. You need to campaign on something big, something bold, something controversial. Because you don't excite voters by saying we're going to change the marginal tax rate by 1%, or we're going to increase the child tax benefit by $100. You don't campaign on that. You have to have a central core thing, and it's actually better if that is controversial. If we step back a moment and we look at 2021, what happened in 2021? Trudeau knowingly, willingly, and aggressively campaigned on a very big, very controversial, possibly unconstitutional, depending on which judges you ask, idea, and that was vaccination mandates. He even previously said he was never going to do it, but come the election, he was willing to do a big, bold idea that was extremely controversial. And what did the other candidates do in that race? Well, the Bloc's the Bloc, so the Bloc doesn't matter in this regard. The Bloc can't win an election. They only campaign in Quebec, so they're not super relevant in this discussion. The Conservatives under O'Toole ran a very milquetoast campaign, kind of devoid of really any big controversial ideas. The biggest and most controversial idea they had was to overturn the order in council, firearm ban, and then they undid that. Coincidentally, they also started losing the election as soon as it happened. Coincidence? The NDP ran on dental care to kids. It's not really that bold of an idea. It's a big idea, I guess, so you have that. And you know what? Compared to 2019, the NDP did quite a bit better in 2021. Now you might think there's other reasons for that, but I would contend that this is one of them. And you can look at a lot of elections, not all of them, for sure. Some elections are won solely based off of incumbency. But if you look at elections winning elections, especially when it's the challenger, a lot of the challengers are big, bold ideas. 2016, Trump, build a wall. 2019, the United Kingdom, get Brexit done. Arguably 2015, the UK, a referendum on leaving the EU. Sweden, this year, in fact, 2 weeks ago, curtail immigration, deport criminals. Somehow that's a big and bold idea in Sweden, but it's big and bold in Sweden because that's, if you looked at the press, you would realize that. And I could go on I won't, because the video's already getting relatively long. But the point, I think, stands. Or at least, I hope you understand the point I'm making here. Smith is leading, and Smith should win because every single thing that makes a candidate win should be going in Smith's favor right now. And lo and behold, you look at a lot of the polls, except Ledger, which again, Ledger's generally good, but in Alberta they typically suck. Nationally, provincially. I think it's their online panel for Alberta doesn't capture blue-collar people very well. But every single thing that could possibly go in her way is going for her on paper. To me, unlike the Conservative leadership race, which was an inevitability, that was a landslide, right? That was an avalanche. This is more like a rock falling down a hill. You might be like, aren't those the same? Not quite. An avalanche is like the entire cliffside falling off. You can't stop an avalanche. You can stop a boulder. Could hit a bigger rock. Could hit some trees. Could hit a depression and not be able to have the energy to roll through the other side of it. I don't think she's unstoppable. I don't think it's inevitable that she will win. But all of the fundamental things I look at in a campaign are going her way. She's running in roughly what I perceive as the center of the Alberta Conservative Party, the United Conservative Party. And keep in mind, this is the center of the Conservatives, not the center of Alberta or the center of Canada. So the center of Alberta, the center of the Conservatives is very far to the right. Like on a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being completely socialist and 10 being Friedrich Hayek incarnate, she's campaigning as like a 7.5. And that seems to be roughly the center of where 7.5, 8-ish, and that seems to be the center of where the Alberta Conservatives are. So she's running in what I perceive as the center lane in a ranked choice ballot. She has a big, bold idea that she's willing to defend and not willing to pivot on. The Alberta Sovereignty Act. And her campaign is making appeals and overtures to the national conservatism tide that is sweeping across the West. So she has the current cultural zeitgeist, I guess is the best way to say that. Does that mean she's the best candidate? I won't say, because I'm not from Alberta. I have no choice in the race. I will not prognosticate. Is that the right word in this case? I will not vouch my favorite candidate here. What I will say, though, is every indicator that I can think of suggests she should win this. Albeit probably not by the same degree Poilievre won the Conservative leadership race, which arguably makes sense because Poilievre also had the nice advantage, unlike Smith, where he wasn't really running against anyone notable in the that was contesting him. If that makes sense. Charest wasn't contesting Poilievre on really anything. He was running a different lane, a different type of pitch of voter to Poilievre. There's probably very, very few Poilievre-Charest swing voters. Very, very few. Toews and Jean are much closer to Smith than Charest ever was to Poilievre, which does make Smith's job harder. In that regard, I would say Poilievre really ran without any real opponent. And I think the final data does back this up. Charest got like 11% of the vote. That's close to not having a real opponent as I think you can be. Smith does. And that might be the only thing that's stopping her from inevitably winning. Though, we'll see. Now, this one's a bit longer, so let me know below if you think that this is far too long. Am I being too indulgent on my political theory? Let me know. If you think my political theories are garbage and they suck, be as brutal as you want below. Let me know. And I will avoid too much political theorizing in the future if everyone hates this. Otherwise, if you liked the video, please press the like button. Press subscribe if you are not already subscribed so you can stay up to date with what I'm doing and what the channel's up to. And share to your friends. Let everybody you know see this so that they can learn about politics. It's important. People are political creatures. If you don't learn about politics, you're not really living up to your role in society. But otherwise, I will be wrapping this up here. And on Thursday, I plan on coming out with a federal Canadian election update. And with that, I bid you adieu, and I will see you Thursday.